All right, everybody, welcome to How to Build a Lesson Plan. This is what we're going to do before we deliver our lesson, but after we figured out what the needs are, needs analysis of our people, what the design of the program is going to be, the desired outcomes of that program, and ultimately even what gap we're filling. But to make sure that we deliver against that in a very programmatic and effective way, we take a lesson plan for the session or sessions to validate it. So let's take a moment to go through the steps behind what makes a good lesson plan.
So obviously the first step of our lesson plan is going to be figuring out what we're going to do today. So it means we're going to basically identify the objectives of each class. We want to figure out what we hope to accomplish in the session. We're going to try to identify the outcomes that we're going to deliver. And then we want to figure out how we're going to confirm that those outcomes were actually successfully delivered. So it sounds kind of mundane, it sounds simplistic, but this becomes the key to the entire lesson plan, right? If we don't plan our objectives effectively, we can't hit our timelines, we can't hit our goals, we don't even know how to connect with our audience, with the learners. And so it's very important that we know exactly upon the time that we set out to do the training, what the goals of that training for that particular session is going to be. So this means, are we going to do a 2-hour session? We're going to do an 8-hour session. We're going to do a multi-day session. If it's a multi-day session, we're going to break that up into sizable chunks. We won't just figure out a lesson plan for a 5-day session. We'll figure out a lesson plan for each day within that session. We might even want to do a lesson plan for each segment before lunch, before break, something to that effect. And so we have to figure out how we're going to walk through that. It's very important to recognize that learners typically like to have a pace around changing the momentum within a training session. So, every 10 to 20 minutes, we want to change it up a little bit, and we want to figure out how we can make alterations in the delivery mechanisms, the outcomes, the messaging, and so forth to keep it interesting. And we will talk about needs, resources, engagement, and interact through this presentation or through this discussion that kind of highlights the need to plan these objectives effectively to deliver the desired outcomes. Of course, we're going to determine the needs of our students, and this is why needs analysis effort is very, very important. We don't want to find out at the beginning of the class that the gaps that we're trying to train against are entirely different than the actual gaps within the class. So we share that needs analysis survey, other types of information to gather needs analysis, to evaluate the gap, to determine what the needs of our student is, so we can set expectations through the learning outcomes, voice with them the goals of the session and the stepwise plan to walk through that session, and then naturally share the plan and agenda, and then come up with a connection activity that links the group's mental preparedness on that day to the topic we're going to be discussing at the same time. You always have to be a little bit flexible at this particular point in time. You ask questions, you investigate a little bit more, and you might find that the starting point's a little bit different than you initially planned or expected it to be. But the reality is the needs analysis survey should give you a good feeling towards what your goals are of that particular session, and whatever adjustments you need to make are going to be very small scale switches that uniquely bring the material to the position of the class and the individuals within the class, rather than wholesale switches in approach. Not that that doesn't happen from time to time, but that's not typically how we plan. The next step is actually fairly logical and relative, and as you see right now, you're going through using some of the technology that we may be using to get our lesson plan across, to get our lesson and materials across, to get our messaging out there. And so we make a list of those resources and materials, and we figure out how we're going to integrate them through the lesson plan. So we think of technology, we think of tools, we think of apps, we think of all the other things that we're going to do, what kind of stand-up, sit-down activities, what kind of integration, what kind of group work we're going to do to bring people together. And we figure out what resources drive those. Do I need dry erase markers? Do I need flip charts? Do I need some other type of engagement tool? And so There's a variety of different aspects that we bring to life in this. We need to make sure that we plan our resources and our materials. A lot less need to flex here. So even if we adapt our previous needs analysis slightly based on our first class and the sharing of the objectives and so forth, our technology, our tools, our apps, and the other materials that we brought together typically can adapt with us to the changing requirements that we had through our first initial interaction with the students or trainees in our environment. I can never stress enough how important it is to engage your students. And so engage your students doesn't just mean those activities that you're cognizant are happening, those call and response questions, those group discussions, those group activities, that analysis question you throw out there, or that, hey, take a moment to ponder this or research that. Engagement happens at every step, right? When we start to think in the lesson plan, we plan these connection activities. That's meant for engagement. We plan content activities. That content activity, even though we're exchanging information through that, we want to make it engaging. We want to make it collaborative. We want to make it interesting to the learner, because that's what cements it for them in their unique way. And that's why we take practice activities forward, to make sure that we actually engage them properly, that we actually got that information across, that they're actually able to display the learning that we're targeting as outcomes for this particular session. So simply put, we talk about motivation, and this engagement is directly linked to motivation. If we are unable to engage our students through connection, through content, through practice, and even through summary activities, our training will be ineffective. Motivation and effective messaging and outcomes of training are directly linked. So this slide's got a lot of information on it, and I'll ask you to read this while I kind of talk about what we're trying to convey through the title and the term interact with information. So we've just talked about engagement, and we think engagement's interaction, and so this seems redundant, and it's not. Right? Once we've set all that up, once we've figured out what the plan's going to be, once we've figured out how to engage students, we need to learn how to interact with the information in a very interesting way. And that means that we are going to interact with the information ourselves, kind of bring it to life, make it exciting, make it interesting, but also let the students, trainees, learners interact with that information as well. Right? So we talked about some of the engagement activities, and you'll see them repeated here in the interact with information, but it's slightly different. So that engagement is an energy, that engagement is a desire, that engagement is a willingness to learn that comes out through a variety of different activities. We have the content activity, the practice activity, the summary and connection activity. But interacting with the information means that we've made those activities meaningful. It means we've applied them to the concepts that matter, and that the students, the trainees, the learners are actually working with the information we plan on getting across during the session that we're hosting. Is slightly different because we need to start now considering how each person integrates and interacts with information, which means we consider the Kolb learning styles, we consider where learning preferences are, and we try and come up with activities that allow us to bring all those types of learning styles to life, so that people have an ability to hear, to see, to work with, to touch, to feel, to do as much as the information allows us to. And so the outcomes are now driven by this interaction with the information specifically. So not just the concepts, not just the ideals, but actually working with the information. And you'll see that in this particular lesson plan you'll see that in this particular class around lesson plan, where you will interact with lesson plan specifically, much like we have interacted with other topics the weeks preceding this. So this just kind of summates the previous two slides, where we're going to actually allow time for the student to practice. We talked about all the activities, the content activity, the connection activity, summary activity. This is, in fact, the practice activity. The goal of the practice activity is simple. You need to not just interact with the information. You need not just to be engaged with the information. You need to actually use the information. You need to work with the information in some fashion to be able to understand how it is relevant to what we're doing. So this might be a guided practice where we actually walk a learner back through what we've done, let them put it into their thoughts, into their experience, into their outcome buckets and whatnot that help it make sense to them. But the reality is we want to know that the learner is able to work with the information, to use the terminology that's been shared and evaluate it effectively so that we can conclude the session based on an understanding that everybody got the outcomes that were expected to come from this session. So this means we can do things like guided practice. This means things we can do like collaborative process, independent practice. And you'll recognize that now if you reflect upon our courses where we've done this kind of, hey, let's help work through it, or work through it on your own, work through it in groups, work independently, but consider these types of concepts. And it allows you to apply those concepts in real life situations, in fictional situations, in recounts of situations that have relevance in the marketplace today or in our learning experience. And then we kind of wrap it up. This means we end the session, we summarize what our points were, we try and get people interacting with the content one last time through a summary activity. We maybe even leave people with instructions for what to do after the session has ended so that the trainees have an opportunity to think and reflect on what was done within the course and how they're going to actually be able to apply that to the next topic that's coming or to an evaluative metric that's coming. And it allows us to ensure that everyone's had a chance to actually consume that information and review that information in a way that's unique to them, and then open ourselves up for questions and clarifications that might be required. So it's a very unique opportunity for everyone to get a chance to put their own label, approach, and insight to the lesson that we've shared.
The final thing I want to leave you with on how to build a lesson plan is to include this ability to evaluate your own lesson plan. This is self-reflection. Did you achieve your learning objectives? Did you provide an opportunity for the proof of transfer of knowledge? Were you able to engage the trainees the way you wanted to? Were you able to see the results you were hoping to see in the outcomes? Did your resources land, have impact? Were they valuable? And then you need to be able to adjust that. You can adjust it for the group in future lesson plans. You can adjust it for the lesson by reconstructing the lesson plan for future training sessions. And so the whole idea is we kind of do that 360-degree view. Did it work for the students? Did it work for me? Did it work in the class environment? Did it work for the desired outcomes? Take a full look at your training program and figure out when that lesson was delivered, if it actually gave you and the students the benefit that you were trying to achieve. And so this kind of wraps up what we're talking about on a lesson plan. Hopefully it's given the great information. I'll talk to you guys in class about any questions you have. Till then, take care.